Hello, can everyone hear? Audio check, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I always wondered if you could count me up to like 1,000 and that and just bore people to death. But we shan't, we shall continue. So, hello, welcome to ACME Comic Con main stage. Can I get a show of hands of who's had a good time at the convention so far? Yeah, that's quite a lot of hands. Some hands weren't up, so that's a bit worrying. Maybe we should take that up with management, formally lodge a complaint. I'm sure Shah will love it. Hands up if you spent too much money already. Jeez, so irresponsible, but please keep spending more. Especially this new book with Dave Gibbons and Tim Pilcher. It's really good. Spend the money. I don't know where that came from. So, anyway, back to being professional. I'm Gary Chudley, your host for this afternoon, and I'm honored to be joined by Dave Gibbons, who is one of Britain's most respected comic book creatives. He's had a diverse and prolific career stretching back almost 40 years. More? 50? 50 years. Jeez. He's perhaps best known for co-creating Watchmen with Alan Moore and has lent his talents to iconic characters such as Superman, Batman, Doctor Strange, the Hulk and many others. And he was also the very first UK comic laureate. I didn't know what a laureate was about 2 years ago. Does everyone know what a laureate is? Well, you'll find out.
I don't even know what a laureate is, but I was one.
Tim Pilcher is an accomplished writer, editor and publisher. He has worked as an assistant editor at DC Comics Vertigo, as an editor on Humanoids, and he's an author of over 20 books on comics. Did I get that number right?
Comics and other topics as well.
And other topics,
yes.
Right, yeah. Cool. Comics and other topics, there we thank you very much. So we're here on stage particularly because these two gentlemen have got a new book out called Confabulation. Get that presented, there we go. Look at that, money shot. An anecdotal biography about Dave Gibbons. So, let's get started right at the beginning. How did this project to make this book come about?
Well, I've always really liked autobiographies of comic artists because having spent, as we've established, 50 years being one, it's always interesting to sort of compare yourself and your life and what brought you to doing what you do. And I also thought for fans of comics it might be interesting to have a look behind the scenes because all you tend to see is the final printed product and you're not aware of all the thought processes and the experience and the background that leads into it. So I decided that I would do an anecdotal autobiography instead of making it, you know, I was born, I went to school, I went to big school, I left school, I got a job, which is kind of tedious. I thought I'd do it as an alphabetical book. So I basically wrote down a list of things that I thought I could write a short essay about, and then wrote them and arranged them in alphabetical order. And I got Tim involved at a fairly early stage of this because we'd done a book before called How Comics Work, which is my how to do comics. So my autobiography is what it's like to do comics.
We'd worked on how comics work. Both Dave and I are big fans of process, and so the great thing about Dave is he's a pack rat and never throws anything away. So you had virtually your entire life, all the sketches, all the bits of scraps paper, everything he's ever done, bar the kind of finished pages, was all in the archive. So that gave a lot of the material for the first book, for How Comics Work. But then you said that actually you had all this other material still that we couldn't fit into that book, and of course your entire life was another book. So this was a logical follow-on really from the first book.
And somebody, I'm not sure who, said you should always keep a diary because one day your diary will keep you. But I think they were thinking more in terms of scandal and being able to blackmail people, you know, which obviously isn't the point of my book at all. But I got out of being a pack rat and keeping all those scraps of paper and those rough sketches, I got watching the Watchmen book out of it, I got How Comics Work, and I got Confabulation. And in fact, Tim and I were talking earlier before we came on, I think there's probably some more to come, so I haven't quite exhausted those filing cabinets full of old scraps of paper yet.
That's great, it's like projects born out of just something you've already done.
Yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to do with the autobiography was to make it very much that it was in my voice. sort of, so it's like me talking to you like I would talk to you if we were down the pub or we met up on the bus or something like that. That I think, I'm very proud of the way that that's worked. In fact, the person who owns my local comic book shop, the first thing she said to me was, "Dave, it was just like going for a drink with you. It was brilliant." So, yeah.
So, you guys worked together on the previous book and now this one. Would it be safe to say you've got a good, healthy working relationship? How do you guys collaborate?
Well, I tell Tim what I want to do, and he tells me why I can't do it. And Tim has got, as you said in the introduction, he's got a huge and illustrious, backstory of editing, and he's a really sympathetic editor. That's what you really need as a creator, and I've found this in doing comic books themselves. People tend to underestimate how much difference a good editor can make to a project. And if you just work on your own in a vacuum, you're never sure if what you're doing is right or wrong, or you're going at it the right way, or you've said enough, or you've said too much. So it was really great to run stuff by Tim and have him give his editorial input on it. And also when it came to the choice of illustrations, particularly with the How Comics Workbook, I wanted to put in there all my favourite, pretty, really nice finished illustrations. But Tim pushed very much for, no, you've got to put the really rough stuff in, the stuff that really shows the creative process. So, in a situation like that, the editorial input is invaluable. So that's how we kind of work.
I mean, it's easier when you've got someone that's very professional and easy to work with. I would say that. And, you take editorial direction brilliantly, and you know what you're talking about and you know what you're doing. So it is there. My job really is a kind of a facilitator. And as Dave says, it's just to kind of check through and make sure there weren't things being repeated or things were it flowed as well. And
Also, what Tim did a huge amount of work on was the index and the bibliography as well. I mean, like, I get the glory because I tell all the jokes that get a laugh, but he was working away a lot behind the scenes, trying to figure out exactly what year I first did Swamp Thing, or as an example, which doesn't even apply. So that's the kind of nitty-gritty work of doing a book like this. It doesn't get the glory, but it makes such a difference to the content of the book and the value for people who are fans.
I'm quite happy being the backroom monkey, just kind of doing all that.
Now, it's called an anecdotal biography.
Autobiography.
Anecdotal autobiography.
Alliteration.
I like it, alliteration. Could you share any anecdotes with us just now, Dave? Keep in mind that, it needs to be pre-watershed stories, so...
Well, all my stories are pre-watershed stories where I come from.
Just to establish that, good.
Yeah. Well, of course, my best advice was, if you want some anecdotes, buy the book, but it's a bit hard, because obviously I don't want to give away my very best anecdotes, or any of the more controversial ones, but...
Was this the boxing match with Alan Moore? Like the street fight? I heard that get really bloody.
Anyway. So, no, there was one particular thing that came up, because a mutual friend of ours, a guy called Rufus Dayglow, I don't know if any of you know Rufus, he posted something on Twitter that took my memory back. And when I was first breaking into comics, I was actually represented by an agent. And in those days, the sort of 70s, there were maybe half a dozen agents in London who specialised in representing comic book artists, and particularly foreign comic book artists, because they could supply the logistics and the money transfer and the translations and everything. And I worked through a guy called Barry Coker, who's still a good friend of mine. I've known him 50 years. And he said to me, after I've been doing comics professionally for about 6 months, he said, "Dave, I want you to come into the office this week. We're going to meet with this guy who's got a rather interesting thing that he might want you to do." So I said, "Okay, great." He said, "So come round on Friday at 10:30, but don't say anything. Let me do all the talking." So I went round his office, and this guy turned up, and it turned out that he came from a company that made wallpaper, and he'd had this great idea, he thought, of having comic strip wallpaper. So you unroll the wallpaper and there would be all these comic book things that were actually a story, so you could read the story on your bedroom wall. And then it would repeat and repeat and repeat. So he described to me and my agent, this was what he wanted. And Barry said to me, he said, is this the sort of thing you'd be interested in doing, Dave? And I said, yes. And he said, the problem is, he said, Dave is one of our very best artists. And of course, if he takes this job on for you, he's going to have to give up some really well-paying jobs. So he'd expect, a fee that was commensurate with that. And given this is in the 70s, I'm thinking 30 quid would be great. He said, so, Dave couldn't possibly do it for less than £300. And the guy went, yeah, okay, fine. So, and he then left. And I said to Barry afterwards, I said, that was brilliant, Barry. You look really sad. He went, should have asked him for 500.
That's why he was your agent.
Exactly, yeah.
But then the interesting coming back to the Rufus book.
Oh yeah, but sorry, let's get back to. You see, this is why you need a good editor. Dave, please pay off the story. And a friend of ours called Rufus Dayglow, I think I've established that, lives in France, I believe, at the moment. And in a shop over there, he actually found a mint roll of this very wallpaper. And it's actually, if I say so myself, I haven't seen it since the day I gave it to my agent, 50 years ago. But it's pretty good, it's pretty exciting, But I've never seen it on the wall of anybody's house or anything like that. But to know that it did finally exist out there somewhere was great.
What was the actual strip?
Oh, they just wanted a thing. They said we want spaceships and we want to have spaceships in action and we want alien monsters and we want a hero and we want a girlfriend and we want a robot. So I just kind of cooked it. What I can't remember is whether I wrote it as well. I'm a bit hazy on that.
Did it have speech balloons then, or was it?
Oh yeah, no, it had speech balloons. It was just like a big, comic page. But the centre of it was all these rockets doing, hairpin turns around asteroids and stuff like that, and an evil scientist. It was pretty good. It was pulpy, and I think it fulfilled the brief. And was very well paid.
Did Rufus buy it?
Sorry?
Did Rufus buy the role?
Yeah, he bought it in France, because he immediately recognised my style.
So I thought maybe he saw it and just went, nah. I'm glad he picked it up,
Yeah.
So, just going back to the book, right? Does anyone know what confabulation means? Right, here's your lesson for today, right? Confabulation is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as a story that someone has invented in their mind. So, the question is then, Dave, are all these stories made up in your mind, or are they true?
Well, they're not made up in my mind, but of course you get into the whole debate of what is truth. I mean, we were speaking about this earlier. There are various versions of the truth depending where you're sitting, or what you saw, or what you think you saw, or what you heard, or what you didn't hear, or some kind of previous disposition towards seeing things a certain way. But what confabulation means to me is, having told a lot of these anecdotes on panels like this at comic book conventions and in print and on podcasts and things like that, I'm aware that every time you tell a story, you slightly polish it up. You make it a better dramatic structure. You make the joke hopefully a bit funnier. You make the peril a little bit more perilous. And so I didn't set out to tell lies, but I'm very well aware that probably what I've told is not the absolute indisputable truth. And it's been quite interesting because quite a few of us comic book guys of my kind of generation have got autobiographies that are out or are coming out. There's myself, there's Skin, Brian Bolland, Brian Talbot, and even with looking at Des Skin's one, where we describe certain events that we were both at, our memories are completely different. Other than where it was and what and when it was, everything else is completely up for grabs. So I think that what I set out to do is to tell my anecdotes, but tell them as amusingly as possible. And as I say to my wife, it's always a mistake to let the truth get in the way of a good story.
I always like the line from The Simpsons with Lionel Hutz, the lawyer, where he goes, "There's the truth and the truth." It's very, very much that.
Yeah.
When you were working on the creation of this book, so it's published by Dark Horse, were they on board straight away, or did you have to then present to them a proposal, or how did that work?
Well, I've got a long-standing relationship with Dark Horse. After I finished doing Watchmen, the next major thing I did was a thing called Martha Washington that was written by Frank Miller. And we established a really good working relationship with them. And I think the fact that so many artists and writers of our generation gravitated towards them was because they were such a sympathetic place to work for. They were published by Mike Richardson, and you could always get Mike on the phone, unlike working for Marvel or DC, where you'd have to work your way up the chain. And they've since diversified from just doing comic books to doing quite wonderful art books and souvenir books. And we did consider some other publishers, but I'm really happy that it ended up with Dark Horse. And indeed, there is a little bit of a nod of the head to Mike Richardson, because he, several years ago, had done an A to Z history of the comics, of all comics, not just an autobiography. And I think that put it in my head, it would be really interesting to do an autobiography like this and just tell my stories. And so it just feels right that Dark Horse should be publishing it. And these days they've got really good distribution deals, and it's available through loads of different bookshops and comic shops. So, I think it's a good place to be published.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to other publishers about it, but it felt that the Dark Horse felt like the natural home in the end. Yeah.
Excellent. Just to clarify, the book is for sale right now, yeah?
Yep. We've got copies here, so after the signing, you can pick up a copy.
Exactly, brilliant. At the end, we'll come to it, and we can do a big conga line to the table if that would be Erin's cup of tea. No, I doubt it, but maybe one day. Dave, right, back to this whole laureate thing, right? So I'm still not over it. So my good friend Shannon's here, publishing at BHP, and one of the coordinators of this event. He mentioned about the comic laureate one time, and I was like, yes, indeed, the comic laureate. What does that mean? I didn't realise that it's a thing in the arts world that it's most associated with poetry, where a figure in that industry or medium or whatever would represent it it's like represent and promote the reading or the enjoyment of that artwork or that medium. And so that's you were the very first one to kind of do that for comics, is that right?
Well, the way I understand it, if you're a laureate, that means you've got a crown of laurel leaves, and it's what they used to do, I believe, in ancient Rome or Greece, to like being knighted or like being made a Dane of the British Empire or something.
Is this true?
Of course it's true. It's not confabulated, mate. And it's not that funny that I'd make it up, But it's but basically it was particularly applied to the arts, I believe, in ancient Rome and Greece, that you wear these laurel leaves. And I think what most people have heard of is the poet laureate who writes a poem when things of national importance happen, like a coronation or a death or a birth or something like that. And there had before the comics laureate been the children's book laureate.
There's the children's book laureate.
Yeah.
So Michael Rosen's been it, and various others. Yeah.
Which was people with a certain reputation in their field became a sort of figurehead for the field. And how it happened in my case, a guy who was a school librarian, who I'd done a talk for, came up with the idea and said, "Would you fancy being the comics laureate? Because it would be a really good way to promote comics." And I thought, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And as you can tell, I don't mind standing up in public and waffling on, which is a thing you need to do if you're the representative. And indeed, it did get quite a lot of, as we call it, media traction to begin with. And I ended up on loads of radio shows and a couple of TV things and newspapers. So it got a bit of interest. The interesting thing I found, though, was going around to schools, which is what I was particularly pointed towards, was that unlike in my day, comics were now accepted in most schools and actually seen as a very good way to get children familiar with the habit of reading. So I did lots of talks to school librarians and teachers, but it wasn't the job I thought it was going to be, that I had to sell the idea of comics. They really just wanted to know more about the world of comics, and most particularly reading lists that would be appropriate for the different ages of children. And it did lead on to me actually working with the Oxford University Press on a series they did of essentially graphic novels that were, you know, famous inventors or great explorers or First World War poetry. And it was a really interesting thing to teach other illustrators, very skilled in their field, how the mechanics of comics worked. So I found it a really fulfilling thing to do, and I did it for 2 years and then passed it on to Charlie Adlard, and I think Hannah
Berry,
and now Steve Holden. Yeah.
But it's interesting what you were saying there about how it's changed that the comics are accepted at school, because there's an anecdote in the book about what happened at your school with comics, which I think is quite interesting, with the Green Lantern, and how comics were treated when you were at school.
Do you want me to tell that anecdote? Shall I tell that anecdote? Anyway, so I went to a very traditional British, not exactly a public school, but a wannabe public school, where the teachers and prefects wore gowns and the buildings were like very Gothic, church-like sort of edifices. And they very much frowned on anything to do with American or popular culture at that school. And one day we were all turfed out in the yard at break time, and they went through our desks and confiscated all the American comics that people brought in, and took them down the orchard, which was the sort of the green space around the school, and burnt them. Now, they didn't get any of mine, so it wasn't that traumatic, because I'd never take any of my precious comics to school, because they're bound to get stolen or defaced or something. But I've got this very vivid memory of one of these prefects walking past me with a big pile of American comics, and the top one was Green Lantern #6. I'm sure you all remember it, the first appearance of Tomar Ray, the parrot-headed Green Lantern. Anyway, that's the one it was, and it was terrible to see this be marched past me to go on the flames, and I thought, I'd love that comic. If I could only have that comic, I'd take care of it. I wouldn't let it come into school and infect people's minds. So, and I remember very clearly thinking, if people like you don't like comics, then I love comics. And it had a, you know, a kind of reverse psychological effect on me. Anyway, years later, my son went to the same school, which by now had become a bit more modern. And I went in the big lecture room, and the head of English was there, and the chief librarian, and the whole of the 5th year. And I talked about comics and showed them how they were done. And they came up to me after and said, Dave, that was fantastic, such an interesting talk. We didn't realise there was all that to comics. Can you give us some recommendations for the school library? You know, we really should be representing these things in the school library. And I thought, oh, great, you know, that's a compliment. Anyway, go fast forward a few more years, and the school has finally got a proper art department with, you know, where you can do oil painting and a kiln to make pottery in and everything like this. And so they said, would I like to come along to the opening with some other old boys and, you know, wish the thing well. And they said, could you fill in this questionnaire to tell us how the school encouraged you in your pursuit of being an artist? And I said, well, I'd have to say that any success I've had was despite the efforts of the school. So they said, okay, that's fair enough. So I went along to the art room, and it was very, very nice. Everybody was very welcoming and everything. And I noticed there was a school prospectus, you know, with pictures of the wonderful playing fields and Oxbridge successes and sports wins and everything like this. And at the back of it, it had a page that said, famous old Albanians. So the first entry in it was Tim Rice, you know, the musical guy, Evita and all that sort of thing. Second one was Stephen Hawking, you know, physicist, bit of a smart bloke. Third one, Dave Gibbons, graphic novelist. So it was amazing to see that school go from burn it to, hey, we're pretty cool, we've got a graphic novelist went here. So that's my anecdote about that. If you buy the book, it's told even better than the way I just told it. Really hard to believe.
So I've only got one question to follow that. Like, please tell me you took the prospectus and burnt that. It's the ultimate revenge.
I suppose I should have done really, but I've kind of mellowed, you know. And I did eventually get a copy of Green Lantern #6, first appearance of the parrot-headed Green Lantern, Tomar Ray. So it all sort of turned out okay in the end, you know.
Excellent. So it sounds like comics in schools has changed quite a lot over the years. The industry as a whole, how has it evolved over time?
Well, I suppose it's become, as the anecdote that I just went through it's become more accepted as part of popular culture and hasn't got the same stigma of being juvenile or second rate, you know. And I think comics, I've always felt that comics can hold their head up high, but I think now so much of popular culture springs from notions that first appeared in comics. I mean, you only have to look at the worldwide success of the Marvel movies, which have remained very, very faithful to those original Marvel stories that thrilled everybody. You know, there is no more powerful set of stories in the world probably at the moment than sprung from Marvel Comics. So I think there's been that mainstream acceptance of it, and I think there's a greater diversity as well. That there are still superhero comics, but there are lots of comics that aren't in the superhero area, where all sorts of stories and experiences are being recounted, and it feels like it's much richer than it used to be. You know, it's not focused in one area. There's the internationalization of it as well, you know, Japanese manga and such cross-pollinating with Western comics. So I think comics are as healthy now as they ever have been.
People that are looking to get into comics, what's your one that this is going to change lives, right? So it needs to be an amazing advice, no pressure, both of you guys. But for people that are looking to enter the industry, what's your bit of advice you would give them?
Well, if you want to draw comics, you really have to love drawing. You know, if you want to get any good at it, you know, isn't it that whole thing about 10,000 hours? You know, you've got to get past your first 10,000 hours of doing crappy drawings before you get to the good ones. So you've got to really want to do it. And I don't think anybody initially ever goes into comics because they want to make money or they want to be famous. You know, they do it because of the love of the medium, and that's writers, artists, editors, publishers. So I think you have to be quite clear that you're prepared to put the effort in. And I think what the world needs is, you know, there's a kind of career progression where you start by working for an established publisher, drawing established characters, and you then move on to producing your own characters and reap some of the benefit of having done that. But I think really, it isn't for the money, it's for the love. So if you love it enough, have a go.
I think the other key is success doesn't come overnight, tenacity. You have to keep at it. You know, there's always, you know, there's lots of people that would like to do comics and do it and then give up. But the ones that succeed are the ones that don't give up and just keep plodding at it. And it can take years. I mean, you've been doing comics for about 15 years before you got around to doing Watchmen. You know, so you'd put in those 10,000 hours before you got to that stage. You know, and working in lots of different areas. So I think tenacity is definitely the key. Never give up.
I mean, it's happened to me sometimes at conventions. You do portfolio reviews. You know, people show you their artwork, and sometimes you look at something that's incredibly well drawn. The guy or the girl are really visionary, but you know from talking to them that it doesn't matter enough to them. Whereas you sometimes get other people who are less talented but have got that perseverance and who will listen to advice and will try and incorporate it and will just keep plugging away. And that tenacity is most important. And it's also what the experience of drawing comics is like. You know, you've got to be drawing day after day, week after week, year after year. So you have to really be in it for the marathon, not for the sprint.
Thank you. What has been your favourite project you've worked on over your favourite project you've worked on, favourite book or favourite character? What really stands out is, I'm very proud of the work I've done there?
Well, really, I think you have the mindset that every new thing you do is going to be the best thing that you ever did. And I think unless you can't think, the next thing I'm going to do is going to be a bit weak or is going to be a bit second rate. So almost when you can't start doing something unless you think it's going to be really, really good. But looking back on things, I mean, obviously I'm most celebrated for Watchmen, so in some ways that has to be my favourite thing. But quite often it's little one-off things that you've done, a future shock in 2000 AD, or a cover that turned out just the right way. I think when you're doing it professionally, you have to be able to stand by everything you've done, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be a masterpiece. And if it does turn out to be not a masterpiece, but it does turn out to have longevity and interest, that's just a bonus.
Just so, your projects.
Okay, my projects. I'm very proud of the Confabulation and our comics work. I think they're great books. Of Dave's work, I think it gets very much overlooked, but I do think Martha Washington and the whole Martha Washington series is really excellent, and was really quite prescient in a lot of the stuff, because it was about 96 you did that, wasn't it, I think?
Started in, I think, 88, 89. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, it's a showcase from that, isn't it? Yeah. So I mean, a lot of the stuff that you and Frank were talking about in there, all has come to pass in a lot of ways, and it's really interesting to see how forward thinking it was, and how beautiful the artwork is as well.
Yeah, I mean that was a real change after doing Watchmen, which is famous for the 9-panel grid. Martha Washington, I drew huge artwork, completely free compositions and everything like that. And indeed, you only have to look at what's been going on in the US recently, and look at Martha and look at the mad president we had. And you think it's amazing that Frank saw that coming 30 years ago. So I've always, and I must say, of all the characters I've worked on, I think Martha is probably the most developed. She's the one that I feel closest to, the one that when I read this final script that Frank wrote, really brought a tear to my eye, because it was sort of saying goodbye to a friend. So and there's about twice as much of Martha Washington as there is of Watchmen. Watchmen's like 350 pages or something. Martha Washington's about 600. I mean, if you added up all the stuff I've done for 2000 AD, that's got to be a couple of thousand, I would think. So, it's. But I've been very lucky. I often think I was just in the right place at the right time, and my skills developed just in time to get, good work. So I just love them all. They're all my children. Which of your children do you love the best? We all know, but we never say.
Anything to do with kids, don't answer that question. Instead of answering questions, now the floor is yours. So any questions, please just raise your hand, and I will run over with the mic and shove it in your faces. And is there any takers? Q&A? Anyone? Don't be shy. Don't be shy, anyone? Any questions? There we go. First one to get going, thank you.
I was just going to ask for any Alan Moore anecdote would be great.
Alan Moore anecdote?
Yes.
Well, obviously Alan and I did a lot of work together, and I do actually talk at some length in the autobiography about working with Alan and the way things turned out. And I think I'd rather lead a discussion of that to the book, because I consider my words quite carefully, because as you know, it has been a fairly ticklish area. So I do speak about it, and I think I speak about it honestly and fairly, but I think I'd rather you read my nuanced and carefully thought out version.
And it is quite comprehensive. You do go into everything very clearly and concisely, so.
Yeah, because, the question I get asked is, what's it like working with Alan Moore? Well, it was great working with Alan Moore, so I explore that about how he actually worked, and the meetings and the discussions that led up to what we did. And then, things tend to have a trajectory, and I do cover the whole trajectory. But it's a small part of the book, it's one of many, many things.
Thank you. Oh, Craig, good man.
Are there any kind of up-and-coming comic artists, or just getting started in the industry, that you maybe have your eye on as being like the next big thing, or the next Dave Gibbons?
I mean, I'll be honest with you, I don't see as many new comics as perhaps I might. I mean, I've got my own particular favourites. The guy whose work I really love is a guy called Chris Somney, or Samney, Somney I think you pronounce it. And his work harks back to people like Milton Caniff and Johnny Hazard, Frank Robbins and that kind of stuff, and I really love his work. There's a guy called Greg Smallwood as well, who did, I think it's The Human Target. So I don't tend to catch people before they've got big, but there's certain people who've recently got very well known whose work I really, really love. And I also think, in all honesty, that there's such good work coming out in comics these days that if I was trying to break into it today, I might find it quite difficult, because I think since the rewards have got bigger and bigger in comics, they can attract a higher calibre of artists. So that's my take on that.
I agree with Dave. I think at the moment we're in a golden age in terms of creators, because there are so many good people out there. And it used to be that you would see, I don't know, a few breakouts, but now there is a lot of people out there doing some really amazing work, and that's lovely to see. I mean, that shows us a healthy industry that's going on. That there are people out there producing high quality stuff, and right across the board. What I think is one of the most interesting things is when Dave and I were kind of like starting out in the business, it was like, I would say almost 100% men, right? And white men, doing it. And how the industry in the last 15, 20 years has changed. The amount of female creators, creators of colour and everything have come along. That's really kind of shaken things up and given a fresh perspective on how to do comics, as they've come in with their own different ideas and ways of doing things. And that's really been good for the industry as well. So that's really positive.
Any more? Right.
When writing The Watchmen, was it kind of difficult to keep tensions high with the character as strong as Dr. Manhattan?
Sorry, can you say that again?
When writing The Watchmen, was it difficult at times to keep the tensions high with the character as powerful as Dr. Manhattan on the side of good?
Well, I didn't write Watchmen, it was written by Alan Moore. I mean, when you think of the circumstances under which he wrote it, it's amazing that it was as well done as it was, because he was doing Swamp Thing at the same time and a couple of other things. And he never kept me waiting for a script. It was there as regular as clockwork. And that was quite important when you talk about raising the sort of tension and everything. The fact we did it on such a tight schedule, I think kept the excitement going for us. If it had just been able to go on and on and on, we probably would never have finished it. But having that deadline was the most important thing. But the fact that Alan managed to write so wonderfully under such time pressure, I think is miraculous.
I think it's interesting because I remember when Watchmen was coming out, and I think a lot of people forget now because they always call it a graphic novel because that's how it's done and everything. But it was originally as 12 comics, and so you had to wait each month for it to come out. And there was quite a big gap between issues 11 and 12, wasn't there? And I just remember kind of like, 11 finished on this amazing cliffhanger, and I was like, and I just keep going into the shop, going, is it out yet? Is it out yet?
Yeah, there was a delay. The 11th issue was delayed by, I think, a couple of weeks, and the last issue was maybe delayed by almost 2 months. Yeah. But we actually wrote a schedule when we started it, me and Alan, and said this is the time frame that we can do it on. But then DC decided to release the first issue a month, I think it was 2 months early, which immediately put the pressure on us and meant that at the end we dropped off it. But we always really regretted that, because talking to the retailers, who are such an important part of the chain of getting comics from the creators to the readers, the thing they really loved was that Watchmen was in there reliably month after month after month. And we really wanted to keep that up, because people think, oh, it's Watchmen Day, and they go in and get Watchmen, but then they buy half a dozen other comics as well. And people sometimes confuse it with The Killing Joke. I know with Camelot 3000 that Brian Bolland did. And Brian Bolland, who's a good friend of mine, does work very, very slowly. And I think the last issue of that was 1.5 years late or something. So we were late, we didn't want to be, it wasn't our fault, and there you go.
But what I mean is it brought that tension and excitement out, it ramped it up.
Yeah, that butt-clenching tension. Because the thing with Watchmen is, until the last page was drawn, we didn't have anything, because they couldn't halfway through it think, oh, we'll get another artist in, or we'll get another writer in. So it was like that thing of the further you went, the more tense you got, and the less you wanted to drop the ball, and the more weary you were. And there is an anecdote in the book about the day that I sent off the very last issue of Watchmen, but it'll take a bit of telling. But if for nothing else, I think it's worth buying the book just to read that.
Excellent, thank you for your question. Is there any other questions? We've time for one or two more. So you might need to. Can you come forward? Is that okay?
When approaching more like complex panels or like scenes, do you have like any methods you use for pushing through like the difficulty of it, or if you get any sort of art block?
Composing panels.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are certain basic rules of composition. You know, there's the law of thirds, which means that in any given picture area, if you divide it into three, where those lines meet is a good place to put important stuff. And if you look at Watchmen, not only is it on a 9-panel grid, but if you analyse the pictures, you'll see that I use those points very much. You also can direct lines in the background to point to what you want the reader to look at. Basically, if you buy a pretty standard manual of how to compose pictures, you'll find all the sort of things that you need in there. But I always consider the composition of the whole panel, the shapes in it, before I draw anything accurately or in a finished way. You know, if I could sum it all up, I'd say you always work from the general to the particular. So get the general layout right loosely and then tighten everything up rather than start drawing and lose control of where you want the people to look. It's hard to say that sensibly in a brief way, but that's kind of the way that I think.
But also you talk about, in how comics work, sort of using black and white space and shadow to guide the eye and getting that balance between the dark and the light.
I mean, you'll always be drawn towards the highest contrast in a picture. So if you've got solid black or solid white, that's what you should try and have around the focal point because it will attract the eye. And you should try and distribute solid blacks and open whites around the page so they don't look like they're unbalanced. But as I say, it's a really hard thing to talk about so briefly. I could talk to you for probably 3 or 4 hours about it. You probably still wouldn't get it, but anyway, it would take that long of me describing it.
But we've got the book over, so if you have a look, you can have a flick through and you can see what the visual representation of what Dave's talking about.
One more? Yeah. One more question, you had your hand up there. Do you mind just coming along? Mr. Umbrella Man.
How did you end up working in Doctor Who for Marvel? For Doctor Who on Marvel?
Oh, okay. Well, the guy who in many ways sort of got me into comics was a fellow called Dave Gibbons, and he used to be the head of Marvel UK. And he was amazed that there'd never been a proper attempt to do Doctor Who as a comic successfully. You know, he'd appeared in anthology comics, but Des thought he was strong enough to have a magazine of his own. And he approached me about it, and I was ready for a bit of a change from 2000 AD because I've been working there for a few years and I could do with the change. And I also happen to know that Pat Mills and John Wagner, the writers of many of the most successful things in 2000, had at one time pitched some story ideas to the BBC for Doctor Who. And so they had these stories worked out. And I thought, hey, they probably would like to get some money for these finally, these things that have been completely scripted, and I'd love to work with them because amazingly in all the time I worked for 2000, I hadn't worked with them very much. And they were quite pleased as well because Des was going to offer them more money than they were getting in 2000 AD. And so we started doing it. We did it in a way that it could be adapted as an American comic, that every 5 issues you had enough material for a single issue of an American comic. And I remember I packed in my 2000 AD work because I couldn't do both at once. And I think a couple of weeks later, it had done well to begin with Doctor Who Weekly, but it wasn't doing well enough to be weekly. And it became Doctor Who Monthly, which meant there was only half as much work. But then that gave me the chance to ease back into 2000 AD. And actually some of my favourite times working in comics was when I was doing Doctor Who with Pat and John, and I was doing Road Trooper here. So, to be honest, I've never been a huge Doctor Who fan, but I really like what Tom Baker brought to it, so I used to enjoy drawing him. And it gave me a chance to set the adventures in a new setting every few weeks, which I really enjoyed. Stopped me from getting bored. So that's the long answer to your question, I think.
Thank you very much for your question. So that concludes. Thank you very much, everyone. Just to check, your table is just over there, along with the comic guests, sort of just to the right. Are you guys going to be there straight after?
Yeah.
Cool. So once this is complete, if you guys want to go over there, pick up the book, get a wee signature, then please join us. Thank you very much, everyone. You've been great. Thank you.